the important administrative announcement is this weekend y'all will have another quiz. It'll be over chapter 7, which talks about the efficiency of the market. So to introduce that topic, I need to explain a new concept. And the new concept is called surplus. Okay, this is different from what you might think of as surplus. So in economics, we have two different meanings of surplus. Surplus can mean, the opposite of a shortage. Okay, excess supply is one meaning of surplus. When there's an excess supply, more supply than demand. Okay, that's one meaning. The other meaning of surplus in economics is money well spent. Okay. So this is the idea of surplus that we're going to talk about today. Again, the concept is more like money is well spent and you get more value than what you spend on something. And we distinguish between two types of surplus. Some is consumer surplus. Okay, this is the difference between the value and the price. Okay, so if I value a hamburger at $20, I'm really, really hungry right now, and I'd be willing to pay up to $20 for a hamburger. But it costs me only $7 to buy a hamburger, then I come out feeling like I've made a good deal. I was so hungry, I was willing to pay $20, I only had to pay $7, and so that difference between what the item is worth to me and what I end up paying for it is called surplus, consumer surplus. On the producer side of things, producer surplus is approximately the same thing as profit. In other words, the difference between the price and the cost. So if I'm a producer and it costs me $3 to make a hamburger and I can sell it for $7, the difference is a profit to me. I sell it for $7, it costs me $3 to manufacture. The difference is what an economist would call producer surplus. Okay. Got it? So for today's lecture, surplus is going to mean this idea of money well spent, and we can describe it as consumer surplus or producer surplus, usually. Okay. So let's go back to an example that I started a week or two ago with a bunch of people buying hamburgers. Anne was willing to pay up to $10 for a hamburger. That's how much a hamburger was worth to her. Bob was willing to pay up to $9. Okay, now I'm going to ask the question, if the price of hamburgers is $6 in the marketplace, how much surplus would each of these people get? Okay, if they have to pay $6 for a hamburger, like Anne, you see that she values a hamburger at $10 and she can buy it for $6. So the difference, 10 minus 6, is $4 of surplus, right? When Ann goes out and buys a hamburger, she feels that is money very well spent. She gets more value from the hamburger than what she has to pay for it. Okay, now Bob gets $3 of value from a hamburger, and if he has to pay $6, the surplus he gets is 9 minus 6 equals $3 of surplus. Chris and Dan get $8 of value, and they pay $6. So they get $2 of surplus. Okay, all of these people would say that buying a hamburger is money well spent. Yep. Now, Ann definitely gets more benefit out of it than Chris or Dan. She got $4 of surplus as opposed to just $2. That's because she really, really likes hamburgers, and she was really hungry and desperate for one. She was willing to pay a lot, but she didn't have to pay as much as she was willing to pay. Emma gets $1 of surplus. Felix gets $1 of surplus. Okay, now we come to George and Henry. They are willing to pay up to $6 for a hamburger. In other words, they get $6 of value, but they pay $6. So for them, there is no surplus. Does that make sense? Okay, and the same for Iris. Okay, no surplus. Then we come to Jane, Kristen, Larry, and Mary. Okay, and how much surplus they get from this market. So Jane is willing to pay up to $5 for a hamburger. Hamburgers cost $6. How much surplus would she get in this market? You're shaking your head. No? None. Okay. 0? Okay. I would say the answer is none. Right? I would agree with you, but you didn't say what I'm looking for. The reason she gets no surplus is because she would not purchase a hamburger. Right? She's willing to pay up to $5, but a hamburger costs $6. So she's out of the market. Okay? No hamburger for her. No hamburger for any of these people willing to pay less than the market price. Okay, now an economist could add up these numbers and say the total consumer surplus is equal to 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1 equals, I think that's $13 of surplus, consumer surplus. This number is a measure of the well-being of consumers in the market. Okay, so maybe let that sink in for a minute. Consumers benefit from being able to buy these hamburgers, and we can actually measure how much they profit in the market, their total consumer surplus, how well they did in the market. And all of this, $13 of surplus, is gains from trade for the consumers, right? All these consumers are better off because they have the option to trade for a hamburger. So, this $13 represents how much consumers benefit. Okay, now, we can graph the consumer surplus, okay? And that will be somewhat important. That will be more important than directly calculating it, is is recognizing what area in this graph is associated with surplus. Okay, so price and quantity, and we have a demand curve, right? That represents the consumers in the market. Okay, first, let's think about Anne and the surplus that she gets. Okay, I'm going to just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, at a price of $6, I believe the quantity supplied, or sorry, quantity demanded should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so this point right here, I'll just make a note of that. Okay, but let's think about Anne, her consumer surplus. Okay, Anne is represented by that top point on the supply curve. That comes from Anne. She is the one person who is willing to pay up to $10 for a hamburger. And so the surplus that she gets is 10 minus 6. Okay, this rectangle right here, this represents the surplus that Anne gets from buying her hamburger at a price of $6. The height of this is 10 minus 6 equals 4, right? And the width of it is just 1. There's one Anne who would buy this hamburger. So that rectangle represents Anne's consumer surplus. Then Bob. Bob appears as the second point on the curve. Okay, he's the person who is willing to pay up to $9 for a hamburger. And so his surplus is 9 minus 6. Okay, his willingness to pay minus the price of $6. And I would argue that rectangle captures the surplus that Bob gets. Then we have Chris and Dan. Each of them gets $2 of surplus. Though actually, okay, so it's the difference between 8 and 6. Okay, this rectangle, the height of it goes from 6 to 8. Height from 6 to 8. And the width is from 2 to 4. So, like from 2 to 4. It represents the third and fourth person in the market. So here's A, B, C, and D. Okay, that rectangle has a width of 2, a height of 2, and that's the surplus that C and D get. And this keeps going. Like the surplus that Emma and Felix get is another rectangle under this curve. Basically, if we count up all the surpluses that people are getting, they add up to the area under the demand curve. Okay, so consumer surplus ends up being the area under the demand curve out to the quantity sold. Okay. So that'll be our definition. That's how we'll illustrate it. In other words, if we want to graph consumer surplus in general, we're just talking about analyzing some generic market. Okay, there's a demand curve. At some particular price, the quantity demanded would be Q. Okay, if this were the price in the market, the consumer surplus would be the area under the demand curve and above the price, the area, again, between the demand curve and the price as far out as Q. Again, area between the demand curve and the price as far out as Q. That area. Okay. Now, we've also got a similar concept for surplus, and we're going to identify the area in the graph that corresponds with producer surplus. In other words, profit. Okay, so we can think about this market. If the price were $6, how much producer surplus would each of these producers get? They have different costs, and as I said, the definition of surplus that we'll use is that it's the difference between the price and the cost. Okay, so like firm A, if the price were $6, firm A would sell a widget for $6, and their cost of producing the widget is $3, so their profit is $3. Same for firm B, they could sell the hamburger for $6 and their costs are $5, so their surplus is $1. Same for firm C. Then firm D, their cost of producing a hamburger is $6. If the market price of a hamburger is, let me take that back. Firm D, their cost of producing a hamburger is $7. So if the price of hamburgers in the market is $6, how much surplus will firm D get? Well, if they produced a hamburger and sold it, they would lose money. They could sell it for $6, but it cost them $7 to manufacture it, so that's a loss of $1. So they do not produce a hamburger. So none, right? It's unprofitable. Okay, so for all these firms, it's unprofitable to produce a hamburger if the price were $6, so they would get no surplus in the market. Okay. We can also graph the area of producer surplus. Okay, if the price were $6, how much surplus? Okay, and I'll go through that again, like in this graph. If the price were, we can go through the same sort of exercise. I'm not going to do it in the graph, and show that the area of producer surplus is everything between the price and the supply curve out to the quantity sold. Okay, everything below price but above the supply curve as far out as the quantity sold. Okay? So it's going to be, roughly speaking, this area that looks like a triangle. Okay? Is going to represent the profits, more or less, of firms. Okay. So in other words, if we want to analyze a market when it's in equilibrium, we can use this graph to identify how much surplus consumers get and how much surplus producers get. Okay, so here's a market in equilibrium. The equilibrium occurs where the equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect. Sorry, my stylus isn't working. Okay. Equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect. So this is the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity sold. As I said, consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve but above price, as far out as the quantity that's sold. So it's the orange triangle here. I'm going to call it a triangle even though it's a little bit curved on one side. I'm also going to call this area below it a triangle. The yellow triangle represents producer surplus. Okay. Now, one thing that we can do in economics is assess whether a particular policy is going to increase or decrease surplus. Okay, so let's talk about a simple application. The impact of a minimum wage, so just to be clear, impact of a minimum wage on the output of firms. Okay, so impact of the minimum wage on the widget market. These are firms that produce widgets using minimum wage labor. Okay, the important thing is that the minimum wage will be interpreted as an increase in the cost of an input. Okay, so first of all, okay, again, we have a market. It's we'll first set this up so we analyze the market before the minimum wage. It has some demand curve and some supply curve. Okay. And the market will find an equilibrium where demand and supply intersect. And then we can shade in the areas of surplus. So the producer surplus, these are profits to firms in the market. Okay. Initially, it's this area below P star, the equilibrium price. down to the supply curve, out to Q star, the equilibrium quantity sold. The area of consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve. Below the demand curve, above price, as far out as the quantity sold. So I've shaded in areas that represent the well-being of producers. In other words, how much profit they get. That's what they care about. And the well-being of consumers, like their happiness, the fact that their money is well spent. Okay, then let's analyze what would happen when, again, there's an increase in the cost of an input. Okay, an increase in the cost of an input cost causes supply to go down, which means that the supply curve shifts left. Okay, so the supply curve shifts to the left. Okay, then the market will find a new equilibrium where the new supply curve intersects the demand curve. Okay, so that new equilibrium point I've labeled as P prime and Q prime in this graph. Okay, new equilibrium. Okay, now the market has changed, but we can again assess the well-being of consumers and the profits of producers in this market. We would, if we want to calculate consumer, let's do producer surplus first. Producer surplus, the definition remains everything between the price and supply curve out to the quantity sold. So everything below this new price, P prime, but above the new supply curve, okay, as far out as the quantity sold. In other words, it's describing this triangle right here. Yeah, that triangle represents the producer surplus in the market. Okay. So again, producer surplus after the cost has gone up. And we can also mark the consumer surplus in this new market. Consumer surplus is everything, so consumer surplus is everything between the demand curve and the price out to the quantity sold. So everything between the demand curve and the price as far out as the quantity sold, Q prime. So I've shaded in that triangle. This triangle represents the consumer surplus. Okay, so here is like kind of the final result. A graph showing the areas of consumer surplus and producer surplus after the minimum wage. Now, what we can do in economics is make a comparison to the market with, the market without a minimum wage. So here is that one. I'm going to flip back and forth between these two for a little while. Okay, so here, I'm going to think about kind of the example of the game we played where there were house buyers and sellers. Along those lines, there are some consumers in the market, and they get different values. I'm calling that utility from a new house. Okay, and one person would get $150 of value. Another person would get $130. Someone else $200. Okay, so those are the consumers. Now, again, we, as the ruler of this economy, get to decide which of these consumers are actually going to have a house. Now, there are also manufacturers. And the manufacturers, the producers, can each produce a house, and they have various costs of producing the house. Someone can produce it for 180, another person can produce for 100, 160, and so forth. Okay? And we want to decide who gets a house. How to maximize surplus. Okay. Does anyone have a suggestion? This is all there is to it. We have a handful of consumers, we have a handful of producers, and we want to make as much surplus as possible in this economy. We want to get as much value out of the economy as we can. So, who should get houses? Which consumers should get houses? Any suggestions? If we want to do this efficiently or do it well. Okay. If you had one house that you could give away to one person, who would you give it to? Those are their values that they get, right? Does it seem logical that you'd want to give the house to the people who get the highest value from it first? So if there's someone who would value a house at $200, that's what they would be willing to pay, or that's how much utility they get from it. That's their happiness from a house. If there's someone who would value the house at $200, that person logically should get the first house, right? And who gets the next house? Next house would go to the person who values it at the next highest amount, 190. And you work your way down, right? So, if we want to be efficient, prioritize housing by the value that consumers get. Work your way down that list. Okay. Then there's also the question of who produces the houses. Okay. So maybe it stands to reason that if we're going to produce the houses, the first person we want to produce a house is the one with the lowest costs, right? So if someone can produce a house for $80, that's going to be the first person we ask. If we want a second house, then we go to the second lowest cost, 100. If we want a third house, we go to the third lowest cost, 120. Okay, so prioritize who gets housing by the values, and prioritize who produces houses by lowest cost. Okay, so that if we're putting them into order, Okay, imagine we've got the people, I've put some names on them, Ann, Bob, Chris, David, and so forth. Okay, with their values that they get from the house, the utility, like how much they value the services from the house, how much happiness they get. Okay. Here's a ranking of the people from top to bottom. Okay. And here is a ranking of the firms from lowest cost to highest cost. Okay, so if we produce one house, it should be produced by Ann. I'm sorry, it should go to Ann because she has the highest value, and it should be produced by firm 1. Yeah? So house number 1 produced by firm number 1 goes to Ann. Okay. And so we can move down. Second house. Second house would go to Bob and would get produced by the second lowest cost firm. Right? Produced by firm number 2, and it goes to B. Okay, now on each of these transactions, we can calculate the surplus generated. Surplus generated by house number 1, that was $200 of value to Ann, minus the cost of manufacturing it, 80, was equal to 120. The second house has a value of 190 to Bob and a cost of 100 to produce it. So the surplus generated is 90, right? We're coming out ahead. Okay, then we keep going down the list. House number 3. It goes to Chris, gets produced by firm number 3. Now, let's look at this. How many firms or how many houses would be produced here? Do we produce houses for everyone? No? So how many houses are worth producing? Yeah.
Is it 4 or 5?
4 or 5. Okay. So the fourth house, let's talk about that. The fourth house would go to who? David. And David's value is 170. It would cost 140 to produce. And so that's like surplus of 30. Okay, the fifth house, it gives Eliza a value of 160, and it costs 160 to manufacture. Let's go ahead and do it. Okay, she gets as much value from it as it's worth, okay, or as it costs. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do that. Is that why you said 4 or 5?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. So, but then the sixth house, if we produce 6 houses, the sixth house would go to Fred, who gets $150 of value, and costs $180 to produce. Okay, that is a loss for society. The value that Fred gets from his house is less than what society has to spend to build it. So if we're making the rules and we're trying to do what's most efficient for society, we would not build a house for Fred, right? Too bad, it's just not worth it. Okay, so yes, we would produce, okay, down to house number 5. Okay, and it goes to E. Okay, and that's it. So here is kind of what maximizes surplus. We can maximize surplus by producing 5 houses. Okay, that's one thing. They are produced by the 5 lowest cost firms. And they are consumed by the 5 highest value consumers. Okay. Again, if we want to maximize the surplus in this market, if we want to use our economy's resources most efficiently, we would decide that 5 houses get produced by 5 low-cost firms, and those 5 houses go to the 5 high utility or high value consumers. Okay, so I think right now I'm going to pause for a minute. Why don't we take a break till about 4:30? Okay? Okay. So let's do a recap of what would happen in a controlled economy. Okay, a controlled economy where the economic planner, like there's someone who can intervene and maximize surplus. There are going to be several principles, but the bottom line is that 5 houses are produced by the 5 lowest cost, and 5 houses are consumed by the people with the 5 highest values. Okay, yeah, and there would be nothing else we could do in that economy to increase surplus. Like that, there are not very many options, but basically, could we produce a 6th house and give it to someone? The best we could come up with would be that the 6th house would go to, I think, F, who values it less than the cost. So no, producing a 6th house is not worthwhile. Okay, well, could we improve surplus by changing one of the producers? Like make a different firm produce the house? No. Like we'd be switching to a different producer that's not one of the lowest costs. It makes perfect sense to use the 5 lowest cost producers. Well, could we do better by giving the house to someone other than those 5 people with the highest values? Again, no, right? The other people would have lower values. So this is the best possible. So the best possible scenario for the economy. Again, the idea was that some benevolent ruler, some kind ruler, wants to do the best they can for the people of their economy. And they can decide who gets houses, who produces them, and this is the best that they can possibly do. Now, we don't live in a controlled economy. So what I want to do is compare that to what happens in a market, okay? And we will find out how markets treat consumers and producers relative to the best possible scenario. Make sense, right? If we want to determine whether free markets are bad for consumers, we're going to do it right now. Okay. Or if we're going to demonstrate that free markets do a bad job for consumers, here's our opportunity. So let's think of this scenario if we took out the planner and just turned it over to market. Let these people decide what they want to do on their own. And think about what would happen in this market at various prices. Okay, so at a price of $80, what would be quantity demanded? How many people would want to buy a house if houses cost only $80? How many? Everybody, right. Unfortunately, I think that is 11. Yeah, everybody would want, unfortunately, I don't know the number off the top of my head. I think it's 11. Okay, and how many houses would be supplied at a price of $80? One, right? Only one producer could sell it. Okay, at a price of $100, how many people would want houses? Still all 11, right? But we'd have two producers. Okay, at a price of $120, now the people who want houses are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and we're done, right? 9 people want houses. How many firms would be willing to produce if the price were $120? We have 1, 2, 3 firms that would produce houses. Okay, price goes, if the price were to go up to $140, then we have 7 people who want houses, and we have 4 people who, or sorry, 4 firms that would produce the houses. Make sure I'm getting 1, 2, 3. Okay, then if the price goes to $160, now we have only Ann, Bob, Chris, David, and Eliza, 5 people who would buy houses. And we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 firms that would produce houses. Okay, if the price goes to $180, then there are 3 people who would buy houses, Ann, Bob, and Chris, and 6 firms that would produce houses. And then finally, at a price of $200, we would have only 1 person who'd be willing to buy a house, only Ann, and we'd have 7 manufacturers. Okay, where is this market in equilibrium? I think I got your answer. Okay, okay, someone else. Where's the market in equilibrium? You can tell me either a price, like the equilibrium price, or you can tell me the equilibrium quantity sold.
160.
The price is 160, and the quantity sold is 5, right? Okay, here's the equilibrium. Okay, so in equilibrium, P star is 160, and Q star is 5. Okay, so we figured out what the market equilibrium would be, and I'll point out one thing right now. Market equilibrium quantity that would be produced is the same as the like benevolent ruler would have picked, right? 5 houses. So that's actually the same. This free market, if people just decide on their own whether or not to buy, the market will gravitate toward an equilibrium price of 160 where 5 houses are bought and sold. That's the same as what, that quantity is the same as what the planner would do. Now let's think about, at a price of 160, who would do the buying and who would do the selling? If P is equal to 160, the consumers are Ann, Bob, Chris, David, and Eliza, right? Those 5 people would voluntarily choose to purchase a house if the price were 160. Okay. The producers, the firms that would voluntarily choose to produce, are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? Those are the ones with costs below 160. Huh. So here is something else I'll point out. These are the 5 people with highest values. And these producers are the ones with the lowest cost. Yeah? So if this were a free market, no intervention from the government planner, just each person deciding on their own whether or not to buy at a price of 160, whether or not to produce at a price of 160, we would end up with 5 houses being sold. They would be produced by the 5 producers with the lowest cost, and the houses would go to the 5 consumers with the highest values. Well, that's exactly what the planner would do, right? If we deliberately wanted to ensure that the houses get used in the most productive way, if we deliberately wanted to maximize surplus, this is exactly what we would call, what our plan would be. So, free market Q star equals 5, and P star equals 160, and the consumers are the 5 people with highest values, and the producers are the 5 with the lowest costs. This is exactly that ideal scenario that the benevolent planner would have picked. Same as the planner's decision. Okay. Do you all appreciate that this is actually a pretty deep result? What happens in the free market when people just on their own decide whether or not to buy at the equilibrium price is the same allocation that maximizes surplus in the economy. It's the exact same allocation. The goods go to the same people, and the goods get produced by the same firms as what would maximize surplus. In other words, the free market maximizes total surplus. Okay. And remember, surplus is a measure of the well-being of consumers and producers, like how much they benefit. Markets tend to maximize how much benefit there is from economic activity. Okay? This is why one of the principles of economics, in the very first chapter of this textbook, there's a list of 10 principles of economics. One of them is that markets are generally a good way to organize economic activity. That's because markets maximize surplus. Again, the principle given in the textbook is that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Okay. Yeah. Again, one of Greg Mankew's 10 important principles. This is because markets maximize surplus. They ensure that the goods get to people who value the goods most, and they ensure that goods get produced by the firms with lowest cost. Okay, so there is an old debate about controlled economies or regulated economies versus free market economies. Okay. Controlled economies are what you usually think of as communist or socialist. The government is very involved in regulating who holds which job and who receives what. Like the economies of Eastern Europe after World War II became like very controlled. And so, for example, if you were born in Romania before, I think, 1990, if you're born in Romania before 1990, if you're born in Romania during the communist era, your job would be selected for you by the government, okay? For better or for worse. You wouldn't be stressing about finding a job once you graduate from university because the government has already picked out a job for you. You're going to be a doctor, you'll be a lawyer, you'll be a business manager, etc. Whether you like it or not, that is your assignment in life. Okay? Now, you understand the appeal of a guaranteed job, right? But there are potentially disadvantages, like if you're assigned to a job that's not ideal for you. There's also maybe some advantage from competing to get your job, right, as a motivator. Okay, at any rate, if you had been born in Romania during the 1980s, your job would have been picked out for you by the government, and at the same time, your consumption would be provided by the government. You would be provided with an apartment, you'd be provided with adequate clothing and food and utilities to meet your kind of daily needs. Okay, that's the idea of a controlled economy, right? People are given their work assignments by the government, and people are also given their allocation of goods by the government. And to be clear, in communist Romania, you could not work to earn extra money. That was outright illegal. Okay? There were a few exceptions. things like raising extra produce on your farm. Like if you were a farmer and you decide to keep some extra chickens, you could make money off of their eggs. Some people who did crafts like shoemaking could get by with like just doing it on their own, and making shoes or dresses for friends and family. But at the same time, like doing this for economic gain was often illegal. Okay, so that's a controlled economy. Today, probably the most regulated economy in the world is the economy of North Korea. Okay, now the other extreme are free market economies, where people just do what they want, right? This is what we're accustomed to in the US. You get nothing from the government, but you owe nothing to the government. Like, you don't owe your labor to the government. They're not going to send you to prison if you refuse to work your government-assigned job, right? That's not how we do things. You're free to not have a job, but when you have a job, you keep everything you want. You also get to make all your own purchasing decisions. If you want to spend extra money on food, you can. If you want to spend extra money instead on housing, you can. You have choices in those matters. And that's what's described as free market. The general belief among economists is that free markets generally maximize surplus if three conditions are met. And I listed these early in the course. First is there are no externalities. Second is that there's no market power. And third, that there is complete information. Okay, then the free market will maximize surplus. Controlled economies could maximize surplus. Okay, but they do have some problems. Okay, let me talk about the problems. One problem is the lack of price information. Okay, one problem is that controlled economies don't have prices. If we really are just telling people what their jobs are and then giving them a share of what society produces, then there are no prices. Prices are actually a really useful way of telling producers what the needs are, right? Prices go up, that means that there is a need for something, and it is a signal to producers to start producing. In a free market economy, it's a motivator for producers to start producing. Okay, in the absence of any prices, nobody gets that feedback that there is a need for a good or a surplus of a good or like excess supply of a good. Prices are actually very useful at determining who gets what. Okay, a second problem with regulated economies is that they require Full information about everything. Okay, the planner needs to know everything about the economy in order to do a good job. Actually, in a free market, only two people need to have complete information. Those are the two people involved in each trade. The buyer and the seller have to understand that trade, but they don't have to understand anything else about the economy. Like, as a buyer in a free market, all I have to know is what something is worth to me. That's all I have to know. Like, truly know that, and I'm good. Okay. Now, in a controlled economy, it's the central planner who would need to know how much every person values their widgets or values their houses. So in a controlled economy, the central planner needs to know everything about everyone, which is a huge requirement for information. Again, in free market, for a free market to work well, it just needs to be the buyer and seller in each transaction who need to understand that transaction. No one has to understand the entire economy in order for a free market to work. Okay. The third problem with a controlled economy is probably the most serious one. It is the motivation of the government people. A controlled economy can work well if the government is benevolent, like it genuinely cares about the well-being of its people, and the ruler who makes all the decisions cares about the well-being of the people and puts aside their own personal well-being. Okay, I'm going to say that is almost always the opposite of what happens in controlled economies. Like, people are inherently self-interested, right? And so if I'm the person put in charge of controlling the economy and coming up with all the assignments of who does what job, who gets which goods, then I'm going to want to come up with rules that benefit me and my family, right? That's just human nature to want to do those things. Okay, so again, a controlled economy really requires the government to be neutral, but in fact, people are not neutral. They are self-interested, and they do what is in their own interest. And that has been the experience of every controlled economy. Seems to be that the planners prioritize their own desires, to be very polite about it. Okay, any questions about this? Okay.